walking monkey. The data I'm going to show you is recorded from an array implanted in motor and premotor cortex. Here is this particularly handsome creature. His name is Isaac. He's been trained to walk on a treadmill for juice reward. These poles are just there to keep him from escaping should he decide to pick a fight with another monkey. He's just walking so that he can stay at the front of this treadmill and drink his juice. And while he's doing that, this little canister here is wirelessly transmitting out 32 channels worth of neural data. So this is data that was recorded not by me, but by Paul Nuyajukian and Justin Foster back in Krishna's lab. And when they lent me their data, I projected all 32 dimensions worth of neural data down into a two-dimensional state space. And I will break down for you in a moment what that means. But for now, just roll with it. And what we saw were these rotations in neural state space that kept pace with the rhythmic walking movement of the monkey. And as you'll see in a moment, they stop when the monkey stops walking. And we weren't sure that we would see this, but it was sort of what we expected to see. And I want to break down for you why we expected to see that. And we're reassured that we did see that. I want to consider this one of the simplest possible circuits that could produce a rhythmic pattern. And two neurons that are recurrently connected, these are going to be excitatory synapses. That's going to be an inhibitory synapse. Okay? Now, we could model this by treating these as continuous valued rate units using some sort of fairly linear model. Those of you who are fond of this sort of thing will quickly note that because this matrix M here, which captures the connectivity, is skew symmetric, that's positive, that's negative, the solutions to this differential equation are going to involve sinusoids. They're going to involve rotations in state space. But moving beyond or lateral to the math, let's just sort of step through the neural logic of how a circuit like this generates a rhythm without worrying about the equation itself. Let's say that neuron 1 starts being active. Okay, so over here in our state space, the state space is just a convenient way of plotting data. It will be incredibly familiar to some of you who've been using it since before I was born and kind of mysterious to others of you. So I will step through it a little bit carefully. What we've got here is the firing rate of neuron 2 plotted versus the firing rate of neuron 1. And of course, when we start out, firing rate of neuron 2 is at its baseline, right? And firing rate of neuron 1 is high, right? So when we start, we're at this point here in state space. Now, neuron 1 is going to excite neuron 2. And as it does so, neuron 2 is going to inhibit neuron 1. So a little bit later, neuron 1 might be back closer to its baseline, and neuron 2 will be more active. And so that's what we expect to see over in state space, is neuron 1 falling back to its baseline as neuron 2's firing rate rises. And what that is just simply a rotation in state space to that new point. Now neuron 2 is no longer receiving much input from neuron 1, so it's going to start to shut down. As it does so, both neurons are going to become quite unactive. And so what we expect to see over here in state space is now both neurons to be below their baseline firing rate, right? And we continue along our circle. Now neuron 1 has been relieved of its inhibition. It can start to excite itself again. And so neuron 1 is going to become active again, and we will have literally, over in our state space, come full circle. So these rotations in state space, this is often a very useful way of visualizing the dynamics, but an equally useful way is to plot the firing rates of each neuron as a function of time. And what you get are just two sinusoids that are 90 degrees out of phase, which is, of course, exactly what gives you a circle. So I don't mean to propose for an instant that there's a little two-neuron circuit somewhere in your brain generating movement. But the same mathematical, logical principles that are embodied in that network can be embodied in vastly larger networks that do fancier things, that can absorb feedback, that can be very stable in the face of perturbations, but they may still exploit that same basic logic that we stepped through right there. And to drive that point home a little, here we've got a completely different animal with a completely different nervous system. So the data I'm going to show you, it was recorded by Kevin Brigman and Bill Kristen from the swimming leech, or more precisely from the disembodied nervous system of a leech that thought that it was swimming. And when I took their population data, which was recorded optically, and plotted it in one of these state spaces, what we see is something very similar to what we saw in the walking monkey, right? So, no suggestion that there's a similarity in the underlying circuitry, but there is perhaps a principle at play in both cases that's not completely different in any case. So now, of course, I'm not plotting neuron 1 versus, or neuron 2 versus neuron 1 anymore. I'm reducing a large population down to just 2 dimensions. If you're not used to thinking of, so first of all, I should say we did this using a variant of principal component analysis. If you're not used to thinking about the world in terms of principal components, just think of this as the firing rate of one particularly representative neuron, and this is the firing rate of another particularly representative neuron. And if you think that way, all of your intuitions will be correct, at least for the rest of this talk. But what's actually being plotted is a response pattern that's strongly present in the data versus another response pattern that's strongly present in the data across many neurons. So to break down, sort of discuss dimensionality reduction a little further, partly just to be reassuring, you say we reduced the dimensionality or we used factor analysis or PCA, and people will sometimes look at you a little strangely. They're worried that you're doing something odd with your data. And actually, all we're doing is something that you're incredibly used to already. You're all very used to the idea that you can take a population of neurons and you can decode something. So, I give you a population of neurons that are tuned for velocity, and you decode velocity, right? I give you a population of neurons that's tuned for position, you decode position. All these state space, or sorry, all these dimensionality reduction methods do is extract the basic patterns that are present in the data in the same way that you might have had you decoded. The one key difference is you don't actually have to know what you should be decoding in order to get these patterns. It can give them to you even if you don't yet know what it is that you should be decoding, which is a good thing because we don't know. You'll see here that I've plotted the data as a function of time, but it may often be the case, especially if you notice that 2 patterns are closely related, that instead of plotting each pattern as a function of time, you may prefer to plot one pattern as a function of the other. Certain things will be easier to see in this visual representation. Certain things will be easier to see in this visual representation. It's the same data either way, needless to say. So what about the case of reaching then? Is there any sort of similar pattern generation going on during reaching? And at first blush, it really doesn't seem like there's any reason to expect that. These are not rhythmic movements. Monkey starts with his hand at one point, executes a very rapid reach to another point. He does not go back to the beginning until well after the period of time that we're discussing here. So there's nothing overtly rhythmic about these reaches at all. But there sort of is, if you look down at the level of EMG. So here we have our friend again. This is the EMG, so how electrically active the deltoid was as a function of time. And you can see there's quite a fine, quite an intricate temporal pattern to the response of this muscle. It's not just some big hump of activity. The brain clearly had to do some work in shaping this pattern. And it's not rhythmic. But if you stare at it for a while, you might imagine, hey, I could probably build that from just a couple of rhythmic components. Right? What if the brain could generate one brief little rhythm at one frequency and another equally brief rhythm but at a slower frequency, and sum those 2 things together? Might they approximate or produce the EMG that the organism wants? And you can see in this case that actually works surprisingly well. So the question is, does it work well not just for, this was the deltoid activity for a rightwards reach. Does it work well not just for a rightwards reach? Does it work well for all of the different reaches that the monkey made? And the answer, let me first go with the prediction, which is that if the brain were using a strategy like this, it should be easy to construct muscle activity from 2 underlying components. And you should be able to do it for all the different reaches that the monkey made. And in fact, that is true. Here on the left, we have the real EMG. So each of these traces is the average muscle activity for one of 27 different movements that the monkey made. Right? So the monkey makes a lot of different movements. Each of these is the average activity of the deltoid for one of those movements. On the right, we've reconstructed that activity just as the sum of 2 simple underlying rhythms. And critically, the 2 rhythms are not allowed to change for each of the different reaches. right? So if one of them's at 2 hertz and one of them's at half a hertz, they're always going to be at 2 hertz and half a hertz. The only thing that's allowed to change between these different movements, upwards movements, downwards movements, is the phase and amplitude of those two underlying patterns. And it turns out that you can fit, and across the data sets, the accuracy ranges from 0.97 to 0.99. So you can fit stunningly well the real EMG activity simply as the sum of two underlying little rhythms whose phase and amplitude is allowed to change depending on whether you're moving up, right, down, left, whatever. Now, I don't know that that proves anything. Maybe it's just a fitting exercise. But it does prove one thing. It proves that if the brain wanted to generate this EMG according to that principle, it could. That would be a very good way of doing it. Many other good ways of generating this EMG, but that would clearly be a good strategy and a fairly simple one. So at the heart of this proposal is the idea that, yes, you may be sending a Todorovian muscle command out of motor cortex, but you need to build that. And so you're going to need multiple patterns present in motor cortex in order to produce this final output. And in fact, you're going to need even more than just these two, because focus just on this one for a moment here, right? So remember back when we had our little 2-neuron cartoon network, you couldn't do that with just one neuron, right? So to get a sinusoid at one phase, you got to have another sinusoid at another phase. It's sort of a dynamical necessity for generating sinusoids. They can't just sort of spring out of nowhere. And so you're going to need, in order to generate this pattern, sort of a little friend that's 90 degrees out of phase, and then the same thing down here as well. And so you're going to need at least 4 patterns internally in order to generate one external pattern. And it's not just that there's 4 patterns. There's 4 patterns that have a very tight relationship, or at least in pairs, with one another, such that if I plotted pattern 2 versus pattern 1, I should see a nice, clean rotation in state space. And so that's really the key thing that we're going to be looking for in the neural data in the following couple of slides, is do we see in the neural data rotations in state space during reaching that look like briefer versions. Say again? Well, what time did I start?
You have until 9:45.
Okay, what time is it now?
9:30.
Okay. These patterns have okay, anyways, we're going to look for things like this. So here's a movie, and it's going to be a movie of actual neural data. This is a neural state just before the reach starts. Okay, it's going to unfold in time. The fact that this neural state here is not right on baseline there simply is a reflection of preparatory activity, right? The monkey has had time to prepare his reach. The neural state has moved away from baseline. Now, in our hypothesis, what that's doing is setting the phase of the rotations that are to follow. In the older hypothesis, this is some sub-threshold representation, right, of the reach that the monkey wants to make, and it should grow in strength and vigor as the monkey becomes more certain that he wants to make that movement and actually triggers the movement. So which of these two things do we in fact see? What we in fact see is a rotation through state space that looks rather like a briefer version of the kind of pattern generation that we saw during walking. Okay, so but how is you say pattern generator, it sounds like something very rigid. How is a pattern generator going to generate all the different movements that the monkey is able to make? And the answer, as we've already sort of hinted at, is phase. So here's the initial neural state before a rightwards reach. Here's the initial neural state before a leftwards reach. They're 180 degrees out of phase. Maybe that's because these targets are in opposition to one another. But watch what happens during the actual movement itself. It's a very similar pattern in both cases, very similar dynamics at play in both cases. It's just 180 degrees out of phase, presumably because the initial state started 180 degrees out of phase. And just to gild that lily a little bit, here are 108 different initial states corresponding to the 108 different reaches that the monkey made. And you'll see that each of them leads, oh, thank you, to a rotation with the appropriate phase and amplitude. And it's a very robust effect. Here's just 4 examples, but we've seen it in every data set we've looked at. I do want to stress 3 things, though. Actually, the first I've already, I think, stressed, which is that each of these isn't a trial. It's the average neural activity for one of 108 different reach types. The second is that what's important isn't just that you go a loop and come back. What's important is that you seem to be obeying something like lawful dynamics. And here I mean dynamics, at least approximately speaking, in the strict sense, which is that you can define a state space the way that an engineer would, and that there's then some rule that says wherever you are in the state space, that determines where you're going next. And in this case, the rule can actually be approximated using a fairly simple linear approximation. It's clearly not quite right. There's some growth early on, and there's some decay late. But more or less, the neural state seems to be obeying a fairly simple flow field. And so when we say dynamics, that's what we mean. I think I've already stressed the fact that the preparatory state seems to set the amplitude and phase of those rotations. And we think this is very important because it gives preparatory activity a reason for existence, right? This is why we hypothesize the brain bothers to set a preparatory state. The third thing is that while it's easier to see and understand dynamics in a state space, in particular, for example, you can tell that these are all going in the same direction and that there aren't some of them that violate the dynamics and go backwards. Sometimes you just want to think of these things as patterns versus time. So if you project this data onto this axis, you get one pattern versus time. If you project it onto that axis, you get another pattern versus time. What are these patterns? These are just response patterns that are strongly present in the data. So many neurons strongly reflect this response pattern, and many neurons strongly reflect that response pattern. And of course, the duality, I mean, in some sense, if you get this, it's really 80% of the talk. The duality between these two representation or display formats, let's call them, thinking in terms of state spaces and thinking in terms of time, is sort of what we're hoping explains a lot, right? That it's easiest to see the dynamics unfold in a state space, but the fact that the projections of these things onto a vertical axis trace out sinusoids is what allows the brain to produce the EMG. So for example, you project the red trace onto this vertical axis, and you'll see it goes up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. You project the green trace onto this vertical axis, you see it goes down, up, down, up. All right, I think I may skip some controls, except to say that standard traditional models and a variety of sort of shuffle controls don't show this effect. You don't get this effect simply because you have crazy multiphasic data. Rotations produce multiphasic responses, but there are lots of things that are multiphasic, and most of them do not reflect underlying rotations. Underlying rotations are something kind of special, and I think I will blow through this point as well, which is just sort of, all right. So